As a doctor, one of the things that I use the most when figuring out what's going on inside a patient's body is laboratory testing. Now, it's easy for a patient to come in, I do a physical exam, and ask them a bunch of questions. The challenging thing is knowing what's going on inside. What is going on in their cells, with their hormones, with other molecules in their blood, how their organs are working, and so on and so forth. The only really way that I can understand what that is through labs, through lab testing. There's lots of different labs testing available. Sometimes we can measure blood, we can measure urine, we can measure saliva, even stool samples. And by looking at these labs, we can get a good idea of what's going on inside our bodies. Now, it's a fairly straightforward process to order labs. As a doctor, I can fill out an order form, much like this one, either paper by filling out by hand or on a computer, um, indicating which labs that I want done for a patient. The patient then goes and has that sample collected, usually a blood draw, whether I collect it in office or send them to a phlebotomist at a lab to get it drawn there. The sample then goes to a laboratory where they do some testing, the testing, and count how much of certain things are in their blood or urine or stool or whatever. And then I, as a doctor, get a report. Um, and then I share it with the patient. This is a snippet of a report from one of my personal lab tests that I had done a little while ago. The format is generally the same. It's consistent from lab to lab. Um, the main elements that you'll see are the actual things that we're measuring. Here, there's glucose, there's some electrolytes, there's some proteins. We can measure hormones. There's so many other things that we can measure. Um, there's the value of that thing inside the blood in this case, and then there's the reference range. Now, the reference range is important because it helps me as a doctor and also the patient too know whether their value is too high, too low, or just right in the middle of this range. Now, there's a few things that I want you to know about reference ranges for lab testing. That's what we're going to talk about today. There's three of them. Number one thing that you need to know about reference ranges for labs is that they can vary from lab to lab. Now, it would make sense that if I'm looking at one particular thing, it would be consistent across everywhere. And that's somewhat generally true. The ranges are roughly similar. But there are many cases in which one lab in one area of the country or the world is using a different machine or manufactured by a different company than that which is used in a different laboratory in another part of the country or world. So there can be some differences simply just based on the type of machine that's being used, how it was calibrated, and things like that. And I want to just pause and having worked in the laboratory field a little bit, I understand that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that those ranges and those machines are kept as best as they can be. And there's a lot of amazing people in the lab that often don't get enough credit that they deserve, that make sure that those reference ranges are as solid as they can be. So there's a lot that we can do, but sometimes there's just inherent variability. One example that I want to show is with something called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. TSH is a hormone that's made by our brain, and it goes down into our thyroid and tells our thyroid to produce thyroid hormone, which then goes out throughout our whole body. The ranges for thyroid hormone are measured on a scale of 1, 0 to up from there. The American Thyroid Association says that the range for normal thyroid TSH levels is about zero point 0.4 to 4. Um, but some labs, like one that I've seen, is shows that the normal range is actually 0.3 to 3. So if you have something that's in the middle, like 3.5, on some lab tests it'll show that it's high, but in other tests it'll say it's normal. So which is it? Is it high or is it normal? Really, that's where the skill of the doctor comes in to know what really is normal or not. It's important to look at have that experience with the science and clinical experience to know what's normal, and doctors are trained to be able to do that. That's thing number one. They can change from lab to lab, so don't be surprised by that, the reference ranges. Number two, when I am as a doctor am looking at lab testing results and one thing is off, I may or may not be too concerned. If it's too high or too low, I want to look at other things that are related to it. And oftentimes, when I do, I look at a pattern, or I like to use the word constellation of things that relate to that thing that might be off to see if there's a lot of things that shifted one way or the other. And that helps me know, okay, there's this pattern, or this, especially this pattern over time, if I do repeat lab tests frequently over time, that show that yes, this patient has this condition or not. So there's a lot of things that I think about when I do that. That's number two. Number three is lab ranges for children. Um, Children are not little adults. So we cannot take a lab reference range for an adult and superimpose it on an amazing little human. It just doesn't work. Their bodies are still growing, they're still developing. I've been reminded of that because about 40% of my patient population is pediatrics. I love working with kids and helping them achieve their life goals, which really is just to play and be happy and not get sick. Um, Going back to TSH, I find it interesting looking at this graph that the age is on the bottom and the reference ranges for younger kids, even newborns, or for TSH are really high. They're much higher than they are for older kids or even adults. So if a newborn has a TSH of 6 or 10 or even 12, I might not worry as much because that's kind of more normal for a kid, a newborn. And but if an adult came to me with a TSH of 10 or 12, I'm going to think that that's indicative of some thyroid issues that are going on. So just because a lab test shows one thing, we need to interpret it based on the correct lab reference ranges for that patient's age. Now, I share these numbers and things like that. Ultimately, they're not intended for medical advice, and the best thing to do is if you have questions about your lab testing, go talk with your doctor because they're able to better help you interpret your lab results and know what's right for you or your child in this case. I'm talking about kids. Um, Ultimately, the goal I think is really summed up by the story of Goldilocks. And if you're not familiar with it, the three bears, they live together. They're off, and while they're off hunting or whatever, Goldilocks comes to visit. And she finds that there's a bed that's too hard, a bed that's too soft, and a bed that's just right. It's in the middle. She finds porridge that's one that's too hot, one that's too cold, and one that's just right. She finds a chair that's too tall, one that's too short, and one that's just right. And as a doctor, I want to I want to help my patients be kind of like that Goldilocks, to not have it too high, not have it too low, but be just right in the middle, right where we want it to be. That a skill that's developed with clinical experience and medical training. Um, and it's one that is really rewarding for me to be able to help patients understand really what's going on with them, with their labs, inside their body. So, until next time, I wish you all the best in finding something that's not too hot, not too cold, but just right.